Our speaker this evening is Curt Witcher, so I will go ahead and hand it over to him and we'll get started.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank all of you for joining us this evening. This is a topic that is frequently requested here in the Genealogy Center, not by a whole lot of people, but persistently and consistently requested. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. I wanted to begin by basically acknowledging and honoring the ancestral stewards of the land, which most of us are residing on today as we participate in this Zoom program. The stewards of this land comprise of thousands of tribes that populated the North American continent, and for which we honor them for their stewardship of this land, and we'll always acknowledge their presence and their part on this land. Indigenous peoples, First Nations genealogical research. I want to start with just a small refresher, right? And I know that some of you may be smiling now because you say, well, that's on brand for Curt. And it's on brand for me because I really believe that it helps us do better research. So no matter what kind of research you're doing it, Indigenous peoples research, researching a potential immigrant ancestor from the British Isles, from Eastern or Western Europe, the methodology is still the same. If we believe we had an ancestor that came over as a result of the Irish potato famine, well, we would work from present day back to that famine period to see if we can make that link. If we believe that we had a First Nations and Indigenous people's ancestor, we won't say, gee, this photograph looks like person has high cheekbones, person has braided hair, must be a First Nations people. No, it must be Indigenous peoples. No, we work from present to past, from known to unknown. And that strategy really should be in place as we do any kind of research. So as we're exploring potentiality of any of us having Indigenous peoples in our ancestral background, we want to start with really sound basic strategies. We need to remember the genealogical proof standard. I like 1 in 5 of that 5-point proof standard. Reasonably exhaustive research that will be so key in doing Indigenous people's research. Very, very key. And the last part of the GPS, the genealogical proof standard, is, writing up our research. Does it make sense? Can I reasonably put this together? Have I taken all the evidence, evaluated it properly so that I can write up this research? We hear a lot. We even talk, some of us, a lot about fans, friends, associates, and neighbors. So critical when you're engaging and learning about Indigenous peoples and learning about whether our family lines that have proven already that we're aware of actually go into these Indigenous people's family lines, whether there's some connectivity there. Really important. Far fewer people have heard of this concept of research in 4D or researching in 4D. If you can think about the paper records that we so often seek, census, vital, land, etc., court, and then sort of 3D is like, well, let's look at friends, neighbors, associates, people who worked with the person. Researching in 4D is going out yet one more research circle where we don't really focus much on the family or the individual, but we focus on the time period and the ethnic group and the geographic location. So if I believe my family was in this particular time and I'm trying to make an Indigenous person's connection, what was going on in that area? Was it a settled area? Who were the trappers and traders and missionaries and government agents and first settlers, early land, early townships being laid out, early towns being laid out? That research in 4D is critical when we're trying to make connections with potential Indigenous peoples, when we're trying to make that connection. So basic sound, really good practice in research is so very important. And something many of you may have heard me say this before, we as genealogists seem to have a challenge with this, and that's pushing the pause button on yet another online search, yet another jump back to a previous generation, pushing the pause button and say, I want to learn more about the person and persons in this generation. Who really are they? Yeah, I know their birth date. I know they were married and I know when they died. But what else do you know about them? Do you know if they served in any official capacity in the town or the county? Do you know what they actually did during their life to make a living? They were a farmer. Well, what does that mean? What did they farm? They were a carpenter. Oh, what does that mean? Well, what did they actually do? What did their children do? Did they have family in the area? Close family, not so close family, distant family, collateral lines. Why did they move to this area? And you might think, geez, Curt, that doesn't sound very genealogical to me. That's not helping me put one more person on my ancestor chart. Well, sometimes getting a great context may not immediately put a person on your ancestor chart, but having that super good, rich context will in the end help you make more progress on successfully identifying and proving that you have identified potential ancestors. All four of those last points there, GPS fans, researching in 4D, and doing the history, those are vital in doing successful research on your Indigenous people's ancestor. Can't stress that enough. We could probably, if we wanted to, end the session here and take questions. We won't, but we could, because these 4 bullet points here are really key for successful research, because Indigenous people's research doesn't fit a lot of the trends, patterns, and record types that we are used to looking at. And that can present a challenge for us, right? So when we want to begin exploring for our Indigenous people's ancestor, I'm going to offer 3 general areas that we're going to touch on tonight. We have a lot of slides and a lot of information to show you. Don't panic, don't worry. So much of it is recorded in your handout. So that handout is intended to be evergreen, where when you look back at it, it gives you actionable processes and methods. And it also gives you key records to search for your particular Indigenous tribe. But the first most important thing of the 3 things is to understand the general history of Indigenous peoples, specifically in the areas where you believe your ancestors and potential ancestors lived. Getting a basic understanding. That's kind of antithetical or reverse to how we oftentimes do our other ethnic family history, whether it's German or Irish or Polish, but it's critical. We often hear, I'm looking for my ex tribe ancestors. And so many times around here, I'm looking for my Cherokee ancestors. Well, if your family is 6, 7, 8 generations in Michigan, maybe migrating from the Upper Peninsula to the Lower Peninsula, or maybe from French Canada over through Detroit, you will not have Cherokees, because Cherokees didn't live in that area. So right off the bat, you'll be chasing things that will likely prove unsuccessful, and you won't be able to make that link with. So understand the general history of Indigenous peoples, geographically based and chronologically or time-wise based. Where were Cherokees or Potawatomi or Shawnee or Blackfeet or Arapaho at different areas in different time periods? Really, really important. Building a research framework kind of means that we have to understand that Indigenous peoples' societies were very different from European American societies or just European societies. And oftentimes when we as human beings see something different, see something that's not quite the same as what we have been raised with, what we are familiar with, what we've grown up with, we oftentimes in our mind almost subconsciously equate different to worse, or different to, gee, there must be something wrong here. There must be something not quite right here. We should try to be aware of our own ethnocentrism and kind of try to park or push down as much of that as possible. That will help us get in the right research mindset, if you will. Chairperson of the African American Genealogical Society here in Fort Wayne often says, you have to put yourself in the right research frame of mind, and it really applies here. The second of the what I would call key bullet points on this slide, after the first one there, holism as an Indigenous people's life philosophy. So what Indigenous peoples, and this is a little bit of a broad brush, which I don't like to do, but because most Indigenous peoples encounter with Europeans did not practice anything like a Judeo-Christian religion at all. So some of the earliest encounters with indigenous peoples, those intruders would report back that these people were uncivilized, that they didn't practice a religion because it was a religion not like Judeo-Christian religion. So we need to be super aware of that. We also need to have what I call realistic filters on, because we're going to see language that is offensive to us today. Barbarians, savages were frequently what intruders called their first encounters with indigenous peoples. And we know that not to be true. That's just a firm statement of their ethnocentrism. So holism as a life philosophy, we'll come to this in a few minutes, but I'm going to introduce it here. We know from any experience we've done with indigenous peoples research that a name that a person had at birth may not be the same name they have as a teenager or adult, or several different places, epochs in their adult life. That's really antithetical to the way we think of given names and surnames. The whole surname concept for indigenous peoples is very different than what it is for European American. And that third bullet point after the first initial one, there it is again, do some history. That's how you need to build your research framework. Do some history. Here are 3 more very specific steps, and this is what we're going to go through for most of this hour. To be successful doing Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, First Nations, however you have learned to identify potential ancestors, thoroughly investigate the area histories where you believe the tribe, the bands actually lived. Investigate area histories in the geographic area of interest to identify possible bands. Are you going to look for Seminole Indians on the Great Plains? No, because they didn't live there. They lived in the Florida area, South Georgia area. Secondly, develop strategies for locating the greatest amount of data on the potential tribe of one's ancestor. That sounds like, duh, of course I want to do that. Well, make sure you do number 1 first so that you're focusing in on the appropriate tribe or tribes or bands of indigenous peoples, because you could spend a lot of time researching the wrong tribe and get frustrated. And third, work through that data, the data about the potential tribe, to get to a knowledge of the tribe and access to what I call individual specific records. So again, not wanting to paint with too broad of a brush, but we should be aware that the same record keeping systems that our European, our British Isles ancestors brought to this continent, the indigenous peoples already on this continent didn't have those same kinds of record keeping systems. They didn't have the same religions that we are most used to. They didn't have the same philosophy of life, and they didn't have the same kinship terms and their associated meanings that we are used to. So mother and father and sister and brother don't mean the same things when translated from indigenous people's language. So all that paints a challenging context for us. Impossible? No, but it means we need to bring our best game to do the best research. With time, as more and more records get digitized, as more and more First Nations, indigenous peoples apply their knowledge to those record sets, the better and better it is for us who are trying to see if there are any connections between our families and indigenous peoples. So you'll see a lot of redundancy here, and that's intentional. So please don't get too frustrated. You'll see do the history a lot. Know the geographic area to determine the tribes. Know the area. I think there's probably some out there, but honest to goodness, I've been doing and been walking in the genealogy space for more than 4 decades. I have yet to see a county history of any girth, if you will, of any substance that doesn't try to take the county back to the time of the indigenous peoples, when they were the predominant population in an area. So we really don't have an excuse to say, okay, I'm researching it, I'm using this county intentionally. Wyandotte County, Ohio. I'm researching Wyandotte County, Ohio. Any county history of Wyandotte County is going to take me back to what? the indigenous peoples tribe for which that county is named, Wyandotte Indians, right? So knowing the history is so important. You need to know the geographic area. So after you know the geographic area, gather data about the tribes in that area to narrow possibilities, study the tribe to determine type and location of records. So this slide is a statement, shorter, I hope. Maybe makes a different kind of sense than the previous slide. Know the area, gather data about the tribes, focus in on a tribe to gather data about records that identify individuals. They typically are not as plentiful, and they're a different type of record than what we're used to. And again, as I mentioned previously, that can be a little upsetting, a little disconcerting to us, but it's okay. It's what we do, right? As researchers, we learn, we gather evidence, we evaluate that evidence, and we put that evidence in the right context so we can take another scoop of data, take another bite of information and digest that as well. So step one, we're going to spend just a few moments on determine the tribe. How do we do that? So all general histories and geographically location-based histories, new and old. Sometimes, and I've known this, seen this, observed this my entire career, people tend to put a lot of value in just the most recently published materials. And in this case, the most recently published town and county histories. That's great. But remember the genealogical proof standard. Reasonably exhaustive research. That means don't just look at all the new stuff, but look at all the new stuff, the kind of new stuff, the old stuff, and the ancient stuff. And pardon the use of technical terms stuff. But there's wisdom, there's data, there's context, there's history in all of that. And it's consequential to get all that history. Critically evaluate oral traditions and family stories. There's usually, and I say that with some hesitancy, there's usually some thread of something in a family story that says, well, you know, Curt, your great-great-grandfather, he married a Cherokee Indian princess. Well, in that particular family story, lore, whatever I want to call it, I know there's a big disconnect already because Cherokee Indian and princess, they don't go together. That's a European incarnation. That's not a thing. So already there's like, or people that are really passionate about, hey, do you want to see a picture of your great aunt on your father's side? Look at her braided hair. Look at her high cheekbones. She must have been an indigenous peoples tribe member. Well, no. In a word, no. As researchers, as historical detectives, we know we need to do better than that. But so critically evaluate oral traditions. There's usually some reason for that. There's some reason, and not necessarily tied to kinship or ancestral tie, right? So we've heard a lot in the Genealogy Center, from the dark complexion to the braided hair to the high cheekbones, to take a look at this picture. They lived their entire life in a teepee in their backyard. I find that interesting at a fascination level, but that doesn't mean that there's any connectivity to an indigenous people's tribe. So carefully, critically evaluate. Study all the maps and atlases indicating where indigenous peoples might have inhabited, where they traveled, etc., in your area of research interest. That will help you determine tribal affiliation. If you're looking for a big Google index, you're looking for an ancestry data set where you just key in a name and boom, it tells you, yep, that was Seminole and they were in this area of Florida and this was the general area you need to be looking in. And here are 4 major record groups where you'll find that person. I believe someday we will get there. We are not there today, but yet we can still do, I think, meaningful research. So just one quick history. This is chapter 4 of Saratoga County, New York. It's an older county history published around the turn of last century. And there's a whole section on the indigenous peoples that inhabited this area. That's what you're looking for. That will begin to kind of put a soft circle, a dotted circle, if you will, around where you want to begin focusing your research attentions. And there are several pages where they're listing evidence of indigenous peoples in that area and important to us as genealogists and as researchers. They're giving us the beginnings of what should be our list of intruders. Those individuals who intruded upon Indigenous people's lands, intruded in Indigenous people's lives and villages. The intruders, because most Indigenous peoples did not have a consistent written record, there was an oral tradition. It's the intruders that will provide us with some really critical paper records, written records. And we have to really navigate that carefully and thoroughly. So these are just examples. What kind of data do we seek? And I just touched on that. We're trying to narrow Indigenous peoples' tribes to particular geographic locations. We're trying to find specific dates that place our ancestors or potential ancestors in a particular location. And we're trying to identify events that might be evidenced in a document. I just mentioned intruders. These are some intruders: settlers, soldiers, traders and trappers, government agents, missionaries, and their records. That's what we're going after. We may find evidence of a potential First Nations or Indigenous people's ancestor in the records of any of these intruders. And there are other types of intruders as well. There are European Americans who lived many years, some a couple of generations, among First Nations, Indigenous peoples, tribes. We want to see how we can access any records they might have left, right? The Atlas of Great Lakes Indian history. I noticed in an early part of the chat thread for this session, someone was interested in knowing more about Midwest or Great Lakes Indigenous peoples. This is a resource that will give you a lot of great foundational information. They have maps indicating where Indigenous peoples' tribes lived in various periods of time from the 1700s up to the early 1900s. This is a great guide for you as you begin your research. Notice where Potawatomi, Kickapoo, Miami, Fort Wayne is in this general area here, the intersection of Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Miami. Notice a tribe that isn't present, and look to the north. Notice a tribe that isn't present, and look over here to the east and notice a tribe that isn't present. Not everyone's ancestors, and I say this just to put a little levity in your time with us this evening. Notice no Cherokee. No Cherokee are listed here because Cherokee didn't live in this area. High percentage of people who come in looking for their Indigenous people's ancestor are sure that they can find something on a Cherokee enrollment record. Well, only if your ancestor lived in an area where Cherokees lived or were removed to. Just more examples of maps. This is 1768. This is another map showing forts, so soldiers as a set of intruders, Indian country in the latter part of the 18th century, and they're showing lines of colonial and just post-colonial forts and movement of government troops clearing out the frontier. Here's an 1812. Look at all of these maps in this area. And again, this is the Fort Wayne area right here, right where you see my cursor moving around this Northeast Indiana area. Great, this Atlas of Great Lakes Indian history, really consequential for, again, trying to find intruders. And this is just a zoom out of that same map area. And a zoom in. So I really like this. In periodical literature, you can find a lot of great maps showing where Indigenous peoples lived. There's a particularly good book for people interested in the Cherokee Nation. That's Race and the Cherokee Nation. And they show you over periods of time. And notice the key in the top left here where my cursor is circling, where Cherokees lived at different times. So again, what we said at the top of the hour, context, chronological context, geographic context, really important. Again, you can see Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek nations during this time period of this particular map, really critical. Just showing you more examples of maps from this book. I'm a strong believer that we in the genealogy field don't spend enough time really exploring the cartographic evidence that might be available to us to help us form our hypotheses about which ancestors are ours and help us prove or disprove those hypotheses, right? So really important, really critical. So lots of examples here just to show you that there's a plethora of good information. We need to take the responsibility of finding that information. It will help narrow and focus our search. And that's necessary when we're doing Indigenous peoples research. Periodical literature, oh my gosh, there's so much in there. Indiana Historical Society publishes connections. There's been a series of articles published about Indigenous peoples in the Indiana Great Lakes area. To use poor English, how can you not use those? You can't not use those. Those are just terrific sources of information and where tribes may have been moving, living, etc. Lists and records of intruders. Again, I put this redundancy in here on purpose. Who are these people we're looking for in the areas of our Indigenous people's ancestors, explorers, missionaries, traders, trappers, hunters, government agents, soldiers, early settlers? Don't discount early settlers. There are some published, not a whole lot, but some published lists of intruders for particular tribes. And this is the intruder, the nation, and their employment, why they're there with the tribe. Notice how many traders there are along the right-hand column there. So this is our research posture, beginning our Indigenous peoples research. Get general data, plot a timeline, get maps, identify intruders, find narratives and other records of these intruders. And something I haven't mentioned yet, but many of you are familiar with this when it comes to Curt, I'm a citation analysis nut. I love bibliographies, footnotes, and endnotes because they tell us the sources that were used to grow up, to compile, to write this particular book, to do this publication. There's gold in bibliographies. There are great research tips and resources that we may have never thought of if we hadn't looked at these bibliographies. So it's really critical. So these 6 things really important. Gather the general data, establish some timelines, look at cartographic materials like maps, find the intruders, narratives, bibliographies. So let's move to intensely study the tribe. We're going to use kind of the same research posture, right? Intruders and their records. Many of them won't have a whole lot of records, and what records they did have may not have survived their life, let alone generations from their life. If you've narrowed to a few tribes, determine naming patterns and kinship terms and intertribal relationships. There's a lot we need to know about how Indigenous peoples' tribes lived. Study the notes and bibliographies of everything. Pay attention to narrator's point of view. Oftentimes we will be disappointed, and quickly disappointed, because we look in records for intruders, and most often Indigenous peoples are not accounted for by name, but by number. And they're typically, but not always, accounted for in what we would consider very politically incorrect and derogatory ethnocentric terms, like captured 23 savages today, baptized 57, barbarians today. So pay attention to that narrator's point of view. Search public and state libraries for records, as well as county and state historical societies. So that's how we determine the tribe. Look at intruders, try to see naming patterns, study notes. We're not only determine the tribe, but we're trying to get more intel on the tribe so that we can begin to look for the types of records, right? So our research checklist, determine where the Indigenous tribe originally lived, migrated, and finally settled in the 20th century. First-hand narrative accounts, government documents, tribe-specific naming patterns. We'll get to that in a moment. Find the Bureau of Indian Affairs office that serves that tribe. Most times, once we get into that Indigenous peoples research mindset, we almost naturally have this quest, like, I need to contact the tribe. I need to contact the tribe. Not so fast. Most of the experts in Indigenous peoples research indicate work through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, work through the great information that's on the National Archives website before you make contact with the tribe. The tribe's not there for us who are trying to legitimately prove our indigenous people's ancestral connection, or those of us who really don't have an indigenous people's ancestral connection. The tribal office is there for the tribe. And as you might guess, over time, many people have tried to use evidence that really isn't there or to aggrandize evidence to try to get enrolled on a tribal roll to qualify for a portion of annuity payments or try to qualify for reduced college tuition. And those tribal offices know that. That's not what we're doing, right? We're trying to find our family story. We're trying to find our legitimate family story. But one cannot blame or in any way criticize a tribal office for not necessarily going, 100% for our first initial query to them, because their first function is to serve the tribe. It's the tribe's office. So thinking that they should be open, easy hours, immediately answer email, have a great website that helps us find a connection ancestrally, that's not their purpose. That's not our mission. And we as genealogists, we're familiar with that, right? Because most records aren't developed for us, aren't made for us. Birth and death records aren't made for us. There's a civil reason why those are done. And marriage records, the same way. So this is really, in a way, no different. But find the Bureau of Indian Affairs office to help you do your research. And then investigate the National Archives holding. I was a little ahead of myself there. So firsthand narrative accounts, there are so many of them. And again, they typically, like high percentage of the time, will just identify the indigenous peoples by number, but sometimes by number in a particular geographic area. This is probably one of the more famous firsthand accounts, the Jesuit Relations and Allied Documents for New France, which is largely Canada, not the United States. Early time periods, almost no names, but it gives you some context. And I'm just quickly going through these slides to show you that 212 savages in that second squared area were among those being baptized. So again, that pejorative ethnocentric term about savages. On the first blue square, Father Millet had baptized 52 persons. Well, at least they were called persons in this particular entry. Federal government documents, OMG, we could talk until midnight just on federal government documents and their applicability to indigenous peoples research. We don't have that time. So in your handout, there is a link to our Indigenous Peoples of North America Gateway. And we'll take a quick look at that in just a couple of minutes. Government documents, they're oh so hard to navigate because, well, they're government documents. When would we expect anything from the federal government to be logical and straightforward and easy? And don't get mad at me for saying that, but that's just from a researcher's point of view, right? But, oh my goodness, Congress has held hearings on so many things, and a number of them have recorded really important person-specific information in these documents. So Library of Congress, there's a link on our Indigenous Peoples of North America Gateway to this. There's just amazing numbers of records about all kinds of everything. But knowing your history, Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of the War, they all shared responsibility for Indigenous peoples tribes. And I use the term loosely, the management of Indigenous peoples and the moving of peoples from their native lands to reservations. So every once in a while in testimony, this is from St. Augustine, Florida, 1867, you'll find someone identified, but this is an imposed name on that person, Tiger Tail. We have no idea, but we have a hypothesis that is probably pretty spot on, that his own tribe didn't know him as Tiger Tail because they didn't natively speak English, even though they may have embraced English later. So there's all kinds of challenges. But government documents are amazing. I love this particular government document because it shows us the richness or the potentiality, if you will, of government documents. Negroes, etc., captured from Indians in Florida. So this is not only a look at some Seminole Indians who owned enslaved individuals, but it gives us a list of enslaved individuals. So the enslaved individuals only identified by first name, but the owners' names of the enslaved, those are phonetic representations of Seminole individuals. So we do have on a government document some individual specific information. Treaties made with the Chippewa. And in these treaties, you get a lot of detail what was supposed to happen, who was supposed to come and enforce, who was supposed to come and make sure that the indigenous peoples were getting what the treaty said they should get, which they oftentimes did not receive. All that's laid out in the treaties, so a lot of great information. And then phonetic representations or English applied names are given to people who signed the treaty, even if they signed it just with their X. So I drew kind of a square around the first group of individuals, indigenous peoples who attested to this particular treaty. This still is available. Another way to get into federal government documents is a century of documents basically for a new nation. This link is still available to the American State Papers. I'm clicking through this quickly because a century of lawmaking, a century of record keeping for a new nation. You can Google it and get to this website fairly easily. This is one of the better ways to access serial set, the United States serial set. Again, we could talk about government documents till midnight, but these have decent information in them. And again, on our Indigenous Peoples of North America Gateway, we give a direct link to this where you can choose I for Indian. It's not Indigenous people or Native Americans, but you can click on any one of these topics and you can actually see specific documents that talk about, in this case, the relief of Apache prisoners of war. What's all that about? So you can quickly go to the actual digitized documents. And again, no surprise, most Indigenous peoples are not listed, but I wanted to point out this last paragraph on the top page and the first paragraph on the bottom page. The Indians have expressed a desire that these three individuals, white men who have lived among them and rendered valuable service, be recognized to receive the same benefits as individuals of the Indigenous peoples tribe. Hardly ever happened. Regrettably, the Indigenous peoples individuals are not listed here. Only the intruders are listed, but we have the names of these intruders. If we're researching in this area, this tribe, we need to record those and look for other information that those three may have sworn before Congress, may have written and is in a historical society or some other record repository. So I want to spend just a few moments. I need to hasten my pace just a little bit about names and naming patterns. We get confused about this a lot. We need to pay some attention to Indigenous names and English names. We like the documents that married to the phonetic spelling and then the English name that the person was given or the person embraced. Typically or historically, Indigenous peoples did not use the same given name surname pattern that we're used to. Typically, historical names do not preserve ancestral ties amongst Indigenous peoples like Euro-American families do, right? So the whole concept of surname, brother and sister and cousin and nephew and niece don't exist in the same way or at all for Indigenous peoples. That last bullet point there can be name changes for a person that surround important events in their life. So names for First Nations, for Indigenous peoples, they establish an individual by what he did or is doing, or by a significant happening in their life. And a person's name could change a couple of times, several times, right? So that's the challenge of names. So just one example that I pulled out of some historical documents, an early 20th century person, Mike swims under, he's also known as Many Stars. Swims under many stars. There's no real relationship between those words or necessarily their meaning that we're aware of, but yet that is the identifier, two different identifiers for the same individual. Mike swims under, his father was swims under, but also known as Chief Bird and Last Tail Feather. You can find documents. Mike swims under, father known as those three individuals. That's not familiar or comfortable to us who are used to that pattern of holding on to surnames, etc. And mother known as mink woman. Just some more examples of how names change during a particular person's life, as evidenced in records, mostly from the European American perspective on treaties and other intruder documents. Touch the Clouds, a war chief who was a very tall young man afraid of his horses, a powerful Sioux warrior that if someone even saw his horse, they would be afraid, howling in the night. Seen by the nation, the name given to or attributed to Sitting Bull's wife. We can understand that. That may not be how she was known amongst the tribe. Just a final thought on names. These are intruders, right? These are government agents. These are intruders recording phonetically what they believe a person's name is. And that's the evidence that we are going to have to rely on. So this name and this name, likely the same person, but they were translated slightly different phonetically. This person and this person, likely the same name phonetically, but they were translated differently in actual letters representing the phonics. So challenges aplenty. Challenge of kinship terms, and this is an Iroquois example. They don't follow civil or canon law. A mother and her sisters are equally described as mother to all of their children. That's a relatively foreign concept to us, right? We think of a mother and her children, and then the mother's sister's children are nephews and nieces and cousins to each other. No, that's not necessarily the same in Iroquois kinship understandings. Children of a mother and a sister are known to each other as brothers and sisters, different from our understanding. Moving with a little bit more alacrity, Bureau of Indian Affairs, each branch serves as a central record repository for Indigenous tribes within its jurisdiction. So look for the BIA office that covers the tribe that you believe you've identified. These records may include enrollment records, allotment or land records, and probate records. Those are of great consequence when we're trying to make that connection. It's often better, as I mentioned previously, to query the BIA office before querying any tribal office. Sometimes we can get exercised based on our experience contacting county government, city government, state government, federal government, and we expect a certain kind of service, and we get exercised if we don't get that service. Native tribes, technically, legally, are different nations, and they don't owe us anything. So contacting the BIA office is a best first step in getting a good idea of what records are available and how to best interact with the tribe. National Archives and Records Administration, again, there's a link on our website. We'll drop you on this page. Oh my goodness, we could spend 15 to 30 minutes just checking out all the links on this page. Notice on the left-hand side, links to descriptions of and examples of American Indian records. Other things on the right-hand side, we could scroll down for many screens. So please do this in your research. National Archives has a nice place where you can click on any one of these record types and see what they have available. A number of times there's a decent description so we can become better researchers. Bureau of Indian Affairs, this is kind of their landing page. Again, a link to it on our page. Enrollment in a federally recognized tribe. There's a whole lot of legality and technicalities about being federally recognized. There are some bans of some tribes, like the Miami tribe here in the Great Lakes area. I mean, clear evidence of their existence here for many centuries. They're not a federally recognized tribe or some kind of technicality. We don't need to get into that tonight. Where to look for ancestral information. This is on the BIA website. Oh my goodness, they can do a better job than I could do in explaining this. So finally, with just a few moments to spare, we're at step 3. Remember, step 1 was identify tribes in the area. Step 2 is trying to focus in on a tribe or tribes that might connect with our ancestral research as we're going generation by generation back, one generation at a time. And now once we have pretty, or at least relatively confident, we've identified the tribe, study all the records or all the potential records, like what kinds of records should I be looking for? And that's really a consequential part of your handout. I believe that it's on, beginning on page 3 of your handout, individual specific data. And we're going to take a quick look at these 4 major types here, right? And again, your handout should help you with that. So census records, annual Indian, and they call them Indian census records, became a requirement in 1884. Non-native spouses of Indigenous peoples are often not listed, and Native families choosing not to live on the reservation were typically not listed in the Indian census records. That's a challenge. The federal government pushed Indigenous peoples to assimilate. The best thing they could do during particular time periods is assimilate. You're not Indigenous peoples anymore, you're Americans. Assimilate. And then those that did assimilate, okay, we're going to do a census. We're going to do an enumeration of Indigenous peoples. It's like, well, wait a minute, I assimilated, so I don't count. But based upon that particular native census, some other benefits might spring. So kind of a pretty exacerbating catch-22 that many of Indigenous peoples were caught in. Amazing history of this continent, not necessarily always in positive ways, but as researchers, we need to be aware of that, right? So Ancestry, Internet Archive, Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc., have copies of many, not most, won't ever say that, but many Indigenous peoples' census records. Look for those there. Being listed on an Indian census record does not prove that you are a member of that tribe. And so you can't use that as tribal proof. There's only a couple records, and one in particular. Only individuals on enrollment lists are considered tribal members. But that's what makes that record group so key. Are you on an enrollment list? Key. Transitional census records, we like the transitional ones because we can see the European American given name and the phonetic Indigenous name identified or attributed to one person. And that helps us find people in European American or civil or canon records, and then find them in this new set of records that were created by and for Indigenous peoples. I know these are going to be really hard to see, but I just wanted to show you that, yes, you're going to have to study some documents because their AI hasn't been applied to them. Optical pattern recognition has not been applied to them yet, nor have volunteer indexing and transcribing programs handled all of the various Indigenous people census records are available. But this is a page from a Blackfeet Indian Census Roll Internet Archive, so it's freely available. So you can see the phonetic spelling to the right of the number, and then the translation of what that Indigenous people's name is. And just another example, I know it's really hard to read, but I just want to show you that there are written ones, there are typed ones, both can be difficult, but they are available. And once we narrow down to the tribe, and then we start focusing in on the tribal records, just more examples of various types of census records. I didn't put them here as something we would study, just to show you the great variety depending upon the year of the enumeration and depending on the reason for the enumeration. Quite a variety. Annuity rolls are a list of tribal members entitled to receive payments from the federal government for a specific period of time and typically related to a specific activity, right? So payment for treaty obligations, payment for being moved off your land, etc. Generally for 1848 through 1940, almost a century time period. The period before 1885 is usually considered to be the most useful and the rolls that have the most data. Again, just showing this to you as an example for some of the Miami rolls for this area. Yeah, really scratchy film and really hard to read and hasn't been digitized well or cleaned up well by any information aggregator yet. But these records are discernible and available. Some have been captured and keyed. Anytime we have a record that's been keyed or indexed by someone else, we introduce a little bit of possibility for error into those records. Enrollment records, these are the official census records for a tribe. So those are key. They're typically the records upon which tribal census is based. And people that are denied enrollment on a tribe usually go to court to say, no, wait a minute. Here's my evidence. I want my evidence reevaluating because I think I do qualify. A lot of records there. This is what enrollment records contain, and you can see why they're so valuable. The name of the native tribe, associated individuals, degree of blood, names of parents, degree of blood of parents, etc. And yeah, there's still some really, really hard to decipher records related to enrollment records. Allotment records just refer to heirship records. Selling a piece of land, everyone has to agree to it. Everyone has to be listed. All have to be listed in those records, and just some typescripts taken from some allotment records. This is from the Southwest. Will and probate records. Yeah, if you don't think you received fair hearing, people take things to court. But wills and probates, those oftentimes are part of the records that people are taking to court. Look at this will. How can I not be on this enrollment record, or how can I not be included in this allotment records of people being paid? Because look, this will says, I have a relationship here. I had land or property here. I had an interest in this particular place. Bureau of Indian Affairs tracks Indian lands. I'm going to stop with this slide. Indian school records. There are many of them. They're not prime records in many people's minds, but sometimes when we're trying to make that connection between our methodical, well-researched step from current day generation, back one generation, back one more generation, when and if we do prove our family line into an indigenous people's tribe, usually those records during the assimilation time period, during the removal time period, are records where we can make that connection. Not a guaranteed, but it's one of the places we can begin to look for that connection. I'm going to stop my screen share and just finish with a few comments, and then I think Kate will join me and help with making sure we answer some of the questions that must have appeared in the Q&A. So I hope that I have not discouraged you from pursuing an interest in a potential Indigenous people's tribe that may have been part of your family history, that may have been part of your family story. A really important thing, I believe, after helping people for more than 4 decades, commit to sound genealogical research. Those 4 things we said at the top of the hour, the genealogical proof standard, FANS, the researching in 4D, the doing really good research. That will get us to our connection with Indigenous tribes, Indigenous peoples. And we have 2 more powerful tools. At the last page of your handout, you'll see those 2 really powerful tools. If you have any doubt and you're having trouble with some of the paper research, which is a challenge with Indigenous peoples research, do a DNA test. Is it magic? No, we don't do magic, right? It's one more tool in our toolkit. As AI, as artificial intelligence gets better and better and more perfected, that's not something we have to be scared of. It's not going to magic up our Indigenous persons, our Indigenous people's connection, but it's going to go through a lot of data for us. And as we ask AI engines better and better questions, they will sift through gajillions of pages of records for us and return data that we might have been hard pressed to find on our own because there's so much data available. So best of times for genealogical research. It's not going to make Indigenous people's research easier, but it makes it doable, right? So the last page of your handout, pay some attention to that because there's some really good links there, including a link to the Indigenous Peoples of North America Gateway for free on the ACPL Genealogy Center homepage. I think now that I'm available for any questions, and I think we have some, don't we, Kate?
We do. So we got a couple of questions about people who are interested in the maps that you used and wondering if you have specific recommendations for sources for those.
Yes, yes, and maybe. So by yes, if you begin to look for them, you'll find them everywhere. So the one for tribes in the Great Lakes area, I would use the Great Lakes Atlas of Indian History. It's amazing. And yes, I know some people say, well, that was published a long time ago. Yes, it's also very, very well researched. Look in any library of size. So, at the risk of sounding immodest, I think the Genealogy Center here has an amazing collection of First Nations, Indigenous peoples publications for many different time periods. So you will find a lot of maps in books on fill in the tribe, Oto tribe, Seminole tribe, Cherokee tribe, Potawatomi, Miami, Wyandotte. So just Google or look in library catalogs, your college and university library that's close to you, or your state library, or your state historical society. That's a powerful combination, the state library and the state historical society, for a lot of Indigenous people's records. So look for those kind of maps there and play with library catalogs. They're far from intuitive, but they're getting better. And play with Google. Put in tribe and map, or tribe and cartographic data. Play around with words and phrases. You'll be amazed what you find. There are some pretty amazing ones. There's also a favorite site of mine, and I hope, Kate, that I don't go on too long here, but the David Rumsey map site. Google David Rumsey. Oh my goodness, tens of thousands of maps from all kinds of things all over the world. But I'm sure in there are many very good Indigenous peoples maps.
Do you have sources for enslaved Indigenous people or church records where they might have been baptized?
Do we here in the Genealogy Center? Not many. I would call the records thin. But having said that, I would just continue to challenge all of us to look for them and to take a look. Most of the, I'm saying most, so please don't think this is a comprehensive statement, but most of the records, high percentage of the records that I've looked at for baptisms of Indigenous peoples, enslaved or not enslaved, or enslaved holders or not, speak of them in very ethnocentric terms and group them as numbers, as I gave you or showed you on that one example. So it really wasn't much about the individual being baptized. I'm just applying my own research experience here. My hypothesis is that missionaries recorded sort of a look at me, I saved 157 souls that have the potential now of going to heaven, and not really a specific record where this person and their child and this person and their sister and this person and their father and 5 children were saved. It was just a bucket scoop. Look what I did. I baptized 157 savages today. So, but continue to look for those, because as you drill down further, so what was the particular denomination of the person who was doing the baptism? Were they Franciscan? Were they Jesuit? Were they Mennonite? What kind of person of God were they? And can I drill down further in those records to maybe get a hint or some actual lists of names? But it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough.
How common was it for a child to be adopted, but the siblings stayed with their biological family? This person says, my second great-grandmother was Ojibwe and was adopted by a couple who lived in Ontario, Canada.
That's a great question. And I'm just going to have to be totally transparent and say, I don't know. There was a lot of unofficial adoptions. There were adoptions that really were not mutually agreed to. So as the generations went by, this particular person, Indigenous person, being attached to this particular family may not have been a mutually agreeable thing, but as the generations roll by, it became like, yeah, this person was adopted. There were some individuals who did adopt Indigenous people's children. They typically tended to be intruders of some standing, meaning they were with the tribe for a while and was truly helping the tribe out. If we wanted to have sort of a campfire type of conversation sometime about Indian schools and missionaries amongst Indigenous peoples, a lot of not positive things happened. A lot of things that really were injurious to Indigenous peoples and to their families and tribes took place under the guise of assimilation, of teaching these young people to become members of European American privileged society, because that's the only way they're going to survive. Their culture won't survive. So there's a lot to unpack there. So don't have a good answer for you. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Is it the same kind of adoption that we would expect from a European American adopting another European American child? Usually not.
Somebody is researching a piece of land, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the county right. Tryon, North Carolina, gotten stuck at local government offices and think there must be some point at which the area was Cherokee. Kind of wondering if you have suggestions about where to go from there.
I do, and it's not an easy answer. So you're in the right place of the country, right? So Cherokee's North Carolina, that's a good sign. Probably one of the more researched tribes is the Cherokee tribe. So explore for, you know, it sounds mundane and it sounds like, oh my gosh, Curt's making a lot of work for me. I wonder if I really have to do all this. Well, as we know in genealogy, we don't have to do anything. But if we want to, find our family stories and the true family stories, we want to do some of the heavy lift. So for that county, I would just ask and just totally transparently ask, how deep and how wide have you gone in Tryon County, North Carolina? What do the early histories say? The question again, Kate, was looking for, they haven't been successful with records or haven't.
Yeah, researching land ownership, and I'm not sure
Yeah,
if it was a temporary settlement or permanent. So
right. So I would just dig deep there. If you have a chance, one of the things that I neglected to mention, but Family Search has digitized and made available online for free so many different records from the beginning of a county and area up to some period in the 20th century. Have you looked on Family Search for any early land records? Can you use the research wiki on Family Search for Cherokee for that area of North Carolina to see if you might get some tips there? I would also look in WorldCat, which is like a worldwide catalog. Search that term, that North Carolina county and Cherokee, see what comes up. Look in Archive Grid. It's a free online database that's done by the same not-for-profit company that does WorldCat, OCLC Incorporated. So look in WorldCat, that's just world plus cat.org, and Archive Grid, just as it sounds. Put that in and see if you can find any information for that county that might give you some new leads and some new clues. I also would offer to you that citation analysis trick that I like to use. So get some published materials, maybe as many as you can find. Maybe see if there's any master's or PhD theses about early life in Tyrone County, North Carolina, and then pay specific attention to the bibliographies in those theses and those monographs in those publications to see if you can muse out any unique sources that may not just be run-of-the-mill, may not be easily discoverable in other online databases.
what annuity rolls also list those Choctaws that received what they called script?
Could, yes, a possibility, but also it may not be covered. Annuity payments, and I try to include that. Usually it's for a specific action, a specific removal, and so it's typically not cluttered with other types of payments. So I never want to say never, but I would say that an annuity payment is for this particular removal, for this particular land, for this particular action. And typically they're not, as I say, cluttered with other types of payments.
So thank you, Curt, for presenting, and thank you everyone for attending this evening. And again, if you have any questions following the program, please send us an email at genealogy@acpl.info. And if you have, or if you would like a copy of the chat from tonight's Zoom, send us an email there as well, and we'll be happy to send that to you. So thank you again, and I hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.